A few years ago, the faculty at Austin Grad collaborated on a devotional book, Lord, Teach Us to Pray, the Lord's Prayer for Today's Church. That was published in 2015. We worked on it for a couple of years before that. For that book, several of us divided up the Lord's Prayer and offered comment in a primarily devotional vein on its various petitions. I drew the petition, Thy Kingdom Come, in the first half of the prayer. And looking over that in its context, I made what seemed to me the observation that the opening petitions of the Lord's Prayer echo the vision of God in which Isaiah was called to serve as a prophet in Isaiah chapter 6. I didn't really get beyond the observation. I included a note about that in my chapter. But pursuing that, after that book went to press, I grew a bit uneasy as I couldn't find this noted in commentaries on the Lord's Prayer. But I continued to give the notion some thought. And last year, the meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in Denver provided an occasion to pull my reflections together. And so what I've got for you today is a version of that paper that I'll now inflict on you. If you've ever wondered what biblical scholars do when they get together in a room, this is something like what it sometimes looks like. Got a handout for you. I hope everybody has one of those. And we'll begin just by briefly surveying Isaiah chapter 6 in comparison with the first half of the Lord's Prayer. In Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet sees, this is the bottom half of the handout, and the color coding is intended to indicate the echoes. In Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet sees the Lord enthroned above the earth as king. The Lord in Hebrew is a couple of different words, actually, in the chapter. In verses 1 and 8 and 11, it is the word my Lord. It is the four-letter name of God not pronounced in the Second Temple period elsewhere. And then, so you've got you've got reference to the name. In the Hebrew text of verse 1, the Lord's skirt fills the temple. In the Greek version, the Greek translation of the chapter, which dates from 2nd or 3rd century BC, the house is full of God's glory. Isaiah sees the Lord attended by a chorus of seraphim, heavenly beings, who hallow his name. That is, they pronounce it holy, holy, holy in verses 2 and 3. You'll see a couple of places in the Greek version of Isaiah, verse 3 and verse 5. You'll see the phrase that shows up in some of our hymns, the Lord Sabaoth. That's in the translation of A Mighty Fortress that many of us sing. That Sabaoth, it's translated usually from the Hebrew, the Lord of Hosts, but it's transliterated. That is, the Hebrew letters are simply represented in Greek characters. That draws attention, I think, to the fact that this is the name of God was used in these passages, so that even the reader of the Greek version would have some idea what the Hebrew text said. Following the searing purification of Isaiah's lips in verse 6, Isaiah listens in on God's deliberations with his heavenly attendants, and the balance of the chapter is given over then to preparations to execute God's will, specifically his coming judgment on the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and on how that judgment is to be communicated to God's people. That's verses 8 through 13, and the passages especially relevant to God's will are in the gray there. Now, the Lord's Prayer, the top half of the handout. The Lord's Prayer opens with an address of God. We'll primarily comment on Matthew's version here. You've got Luke's for reference. The Lord's Prayer addresses God as our Father who dwells in the heavens. Matthew chapter 6, verse 9. This might be taken to suggest a setting remote from Isaiah's vision of the Lord in the temple in Jerusalem, but in apocalypses and in other literature around the time the New Testament was written, The imagery of Isaiah 6, along with that of Ezekiel chapter 1 and Daniel 7 and other passages that describe God's enthronement, are used in reference to God enthroned in his heavenly temple, his celestial house, where the seraphs chant the Sanctus, the holy, 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 before God's heavenly throne. We see one example of that in the book of Revelation, chapter 4. In its first petition, after addressing God, the prayer asks that God's name be hallowed or sanctified, consecrated in praise, as Isaiah depicts the seraphim doing. In parallel with that petition, the second appeals for God's kingdom or kingship or reign, what is glimpsed by Isaiah in his vision, to come, that is, to arrive in its fullness upon the earth, as is clear from the phrase that concludes the first half of the prayer, as in heaven, also on earth, in the yellow. That is, Jesus' disciples pray that the order obtaining in heaven be extended to embrace the world that human beings see and know. The third petition then implores that God's will be done. Verse 10. Considered as an echo of Isaiah chapter 6, this would be more diffuse than the two earlier petitions. There is no reference to the divine will explicit in the text of Isaiah 6. But from verse 8 onward, the chapter is given over to discussion of the divine king's will, his intent to judge his people, and how that will is to be communicated to them. The prayer appeals for God to act on the earth so that his name will be consecrated in praise, his kingdom fully arrive, his will be enacted here below, even as angels consecrate his name and heavenly beings rush to carry out his will in heaven. That at least is the proposal. As you see, there are much slighter echoes of that one might detect in Luke's account of the prayer. In an influential book published in 1989, Richard Hayes, the book was called Echoes of Scripture in the Letters of Paul, Richard Hayes proposed 7 rules of thumb to help determine whether to treat a particular phrase as an echo of an Old Testament passage in the New Testament. And the main section of the paper just goes through Hayes' criteria and applies them to the text of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew. So briefly, Hayes' first criterion is availability. As he asks it, was the proposed source of the echo available to the author and or original readers? As far as the author of Matthew goes, the answer is clearly yes. Matthew 13, verses 13 to 15, first alludes to the chapter, Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, and then immediately adds a quotation attributing this passage to the prophet by name. And that means there's also no question that Matthew's audience had their attention drawn to Isaiah's theophany in their initial hearing of the gospel and in the repeated readings of the gospel that followed in time, as we know from literature of the 2nd century. So even if a member of the church where Matthew was read had no knowledge of Isaiah's theophany, by the time you've heard Matthew, the gospel according to Matthew read, you'd know about it. It could be looked up and studied. So, yes, the passage was available. The passage from which the echo comes was available. Hayes' second criterion is volume. That is, as he puts it, the degree of explicit repetitions of words or syntactical patterns, though other factors may also be relevant. For example, how distinctive or prominent is the precursor text within Scripture, and how much rhetorical stress does the echo receive? Abbreviating an extensive and somewhat tedious discussion, I'll admit that the proposed echo is not overwhelming, especially in view of the history of interpretation to which we're coming. Consists of 2 terms cognate with language in the Greek version of Isaiah 6, hallowed and kingdom are the key words, supported by a reference to God's dwelling in heaven, in contrast to the earthbound disciples who offer the prayer, and then the summing up of the second half of Isaiah 6 as concerned with the accomplishment of God's will. So I wouldn't say it's a certainty, but I do have to confess that I'm convinced I've heard echoes of Isaiah 6 in the opening lines of the Lord's Prayer It's become something of an earworm for me, in fact, and so I look forward to discerning whether others, to learning whether others discern it as well. Hayes' third criterion is recurrence. How often does Matthew elsewhere cite or allude to the same scriptural passage, including larger portions of Scripture to which Matthew repeatedly refers? Where Hayes has talked about Paul, I'm talking about Matthew. And here we're back on firm ground. Matthew sets great store by the prophet Isaiah, includes a total of 6 quotations of the prophet Isaiah by name, and a 7th quotation attributed to the prophet in the birth narrative. In addition to one other unmistakable allusion in the story of the 2 emissaries of John the Baptist sent to ask Jesus whether he's the one to come, or do they look for another. 2 of Matthew's explicit quotations come from Isaiah chapters 7 and 8, right after chapter 6, and there's of course there's the citation from chapter 6 in Matthew chapter 13 that we mentioned a moment ago. So clearly Matthew had pondered the ministry of Jesus in light of Isaiah, and in light of Isaiah chapter 6 specifically. Hayes' fourth criterion concerns the history of interpretation. He asks, have other readers, both critical and pre-critical, heard the same echoes? And this was, for me, one of the most exciting parts of noticing this and then working on it, as the prayer's allusions to Isaiah chapter 6 appear to have escaped the notice of most interpreters. I will confess that I did not complete an exhaustive review of all the literature that comments on the Lord's Prayer, nor am I likely to, as life is short. But I did survey enough commentaries and articles and other works that treat the Lord's Prayer, including enough sources that might be expected to cite Isaiah chapter 6 if there were an established tradition of explicating the prayer in light of the Isaiah passage, to conclude that its use is quite rare. I found a few references to Isaiah chapter 6, especially to the angel's chant, "Holy, holy, holy," in verse 3, used mainly just to say, what does the prayer mean when it says, "Hallowed, let be sanctified your name"? What does that mean? And a few commentators cite Isaiah 6:3 in that respect. The church father, John Chrysostom, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, an essay by a scholar in a volume devoted to the Lord's Prayer from about 20 years ago. And an honorable mention in this regard goes to Johann Albrecht Bengel, who in 1742 refers to the holy, holy, holy that appears in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 8. He doesn't mention Isaiah, but he cites the Revelation passage, and that passage is adapted from Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3. We'll come back to the history of interpretation in a moment. Fifth, Hayes asks about historical plausibility. Could Matthew have intended the alleged meaning effect? Could his readers have understood it? And here I suggest that the evidence of the book of Revelation strongly suggests that he could, and could have expected his readers to at least discern it in time. Revelation was written a decade or two after Matthew, or perhaps a decade or two before. It's hard to date. And initially circulated within Asia Minor, at least. And the Apocalypse presents as its centerpiece John's vision in Revelation chapters 4 and 5 of God enthroned as king in heaven, attended by heavenly beings, ceaselessly chanting Isaiah's "Holy, holy, holy." And the burden of the book that follows that vision in chapters 4 and 5 involves the unveiling of the will of God, soon to be accomplished. This vision is introduced in chapter 5 in the image of the scroll in God's hand as he sits on the throne, which is unsealed and opened by the Lamb, beginning in chapter 6. So the book of Revelation is in significant part an extended unveiling or unpacking of the same echoes of Isaiah 6 that we're suggesting can be found in the opening petitions of the Lord's Prayer. Indeed, it's tempting to suggest that the vision in Revelation chapters 4 and 5 is in fact a kind of commentary on the Lord's Prayer, as known to John from Matthew's Gospel or from liturgical or devotional practice. Another point favoring the echo's historical plausibility, that's still the criterion we're on, is the similarity that many scholars have observed between the opening of the Lord's Prayer and ancient Jewish prayer traditions, especially one prayer found in the third of the rabbinic 18 benedictions known as the Kaddish. That prayer goes something like, it's hard to trace the earliest form, but something like, "Exalted and hallowed be his, God's, great name in the world which he created according to his will. May he let his kingdom rule in your lifetime and in your days and in the lifetime of the whole house of Israel, speedily and soon." Now, many commentators have drawn attention to that prayer in connection with the Lord's Prayer and suggested that they're developing the same sort of traditions of Jewish prayer, that Jesus appropriates language and imagery that would have been familiar to his contemporaries in framing the Lord's Prayer. A few scholars have noted the influence of Isaiah chapter 6 on that prayer and on related prayers known to us from the rabbinic tradition. The Dead Sea Scrolls document similar practices of daily prayer within the sectarian fellowship that called itself the Unity. And so the paper surveys those. In light of those parallels, with forms of daily communal prayer that can be traced as early as the 2nd century BC, I offer the suggestion that the Lord's Prayer originated as the daily prayer appointed for followers of Jesus. Now, that's not explicit in its presentation in either Matthew or Luke. You just have, "When you pray, say," or "pray then in this way." But it's not inconsistent with those passages, in both of which the prayer is offered to Jesus' disciples as a model for their regular practice of prayer. It might be thought to count against the suggestion that was the prayer's intended use, in that neither Paul nor Mark, both of which I regard as earlier than Matthew's Gospel, mention that. Certainly Paul is earlier than Matthew. But I'd suggest that's not decisive evidence against this prayer having served as the regular daily prayer of followers of Jesus, if the prayer's use was early enough established as a daily practice among Jesus' followers. The rabbinic law code, the Mishnah, dating from about the year 200 AD, opens with a discussion of when you have to pray the daily prayer. The real question is, when have you missed it? How early do you have to get it in order to satisfy your obligation? That kind of thing is very important to the rabbis, who are the successors to the Pharisees in the New Testament. So you want to get the procedure right. So there's an extensive discussion of that. It nowhere quotes the prayer, the Shema, that the Jews were expected to pray. There's just when do you say the blessing? How do you know when you're too late? That's because the prayer was so well established, everybody knew, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And everybody knew that as a prayer that they were obligated to pray daily. And so you can just go right to the question that the rabbis are trying to sort out. I suggest it might be similar in Paul. The usage is established. Paul talks about his own regular practice of prayer, and he asks his churches to pray with him and to pray for him. But he doesn't have to lay down the prayer and say, here's the text of it. Everybody already knows it and is doing it. Hayes' two remaining criteria are thematic coherence and satisfaction. How well does the alleged echo fit in with the rest of the text? Does the proposed reading make sense and illuminate what's around it? Illuminate the surrounding discourse, or produce for the reader a satisfying account of the effect of the intertextual relation. I will not burden you with the detail on those, but by this point you won't be surprised to find that the paper offers an affirmative answer to both of those questions. So back to the history of interpretation. I only found those scattered references to Isaiah 6 in the commentaries, basically on the meaning of the word hallowed, and not taking any broader approach to the interpretation of the prayer than that. I confess I grew rather excited as this project proceeded to think that I might have stumbled onto a discovery, or at least a much neglected interpretation. And so I have to confess I was at first quite disappointed to come upon the book On Earth as in Heaven by David Carr. It's the 2017 publication of his dissertation at the University of Durham in England, devoted to the Lord's Prayer. Part of this involved discovering one of the perils of the scholarly vocation, as I found myself going to commentary after commentary, hoping, I sure hope nobody has seen the key to the Lord's Prayer. There's a spiritual danger involved in that one wants to watch out for. Carr and I evidently made something of the same observation about the same time. And I got over my disappointment at finding his discussion when I realized that while I had more detailed argument for the echo of Isaiah chapter 6 in the opening lines, which you've been very good to suffer through, Carr had a better interpretation of the prayer as a whole in light of that echo. Scholars are sometimes known to forget the so what as we deal with the text of Scripture. So I was very glad to find that, and we'll close with just these few lines from Carr's discussion of the so what. He writes, "The contrast between heaven and earth, seen clearly throughout Matthew's Gospel, is also found in the Lord's Prayer. The first three petitions of this prayer illuminate the abundance of heaven, whereas the final four petitions call attention to the poverty of the earth. Looking at the first section of the prayer, we find that everything that rightly belongs to God finds its source in the realm of heaven. He is addressed as our Father in heaven, our Father who is in the place where things are right. It continues with three petitions that all relate to him. Hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. In heaven, all of these things are already happening. God's name is hallowed by those in his presence who cry, holy, holy, holy. In heaven, he sits on a throne. All who dwell in heaven obey the Father's will." The purpose of the opening section of the Lord's Prayer is to draw those who pray into the heavenly realm where they can envision what it looks like in the place where everything is right. Standing in sharp contrast to the rightness of heaven is the desperate situation of the earth. The last four petitions, give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our debts, lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil, all convey the idea of human need. On the earth, we see humanity's vulnerability. We need bread every day. We are prone to sin. We find it difficult to forgive others. We fail when we are tested, and we are susceptible to the powerful influence of evil. There is reason for hope, however. Throughout his gospel, Matthew has set forth the idea that heaven and earth will be brought into union. The tension that stands between these two realms and the hope of its resolution are encapsulated in the Lord's Prayer. The core vision of this prayer is that the fullness of heaven will supply the need of the earth. The two realms will become one. That's the hope in which we live and serve and study. It is a great privilege to be able to spend one's working life in the study of Scripture, and hopefully to open up its vision to others. I appreciate the support and the encouragement of you folks, as always, at Friends Day. Thank you.